All right, we're going to introduce the 12 cranial nerves. As you move from the front of the brain back toward the back of the brain through the different brain regions, there are different nerves that come off from the brain. They're paired, one left, one right for each of these. They go out to different parts, mostly of the head, but also to the thoracic and abdominal cavity, as we will see. So they are numbered usually by their Roman numeral 1, 2, 3, 4, and on, but they also have other names that we assign to each of the 12 cranial nerves. Some of the 12 cranial nerves are only sensory in their function. They only receive information. They're not motor. They don't send out any signals that involve a response from a muscle or a gland of any kind. Some of them are only motor. They only send motor signals out. There's not really a significant sensory element to it to bring information in. So we'll identify them as either sensory or motor or mixed. So we call one, a nerve that has both sensory and motor functions together, as a mixed cranial nerve. So the first one, olfactory, the olfactory nerve. It's only a sensory nerve. It only has incoming information. Gives you your sense of smell. It's located, of course, you have your sensory epithelium there in the roof of your nasal passages, and it relays directly to the brain through the cribriform plate of the skull. Next, the optic nerve. It carries information from your retina to your brain. It is also sensory only. It doesn't carry any motor signals out to control anything regarding your retina there. The next one is named oculomotor. Oculomotor. From its name, you gather right away that it's a motor nerve. It carries motor signals that control eye movement. Oculo refers to the eyeball, the oculus, the eye, and then motor. So this is a motor nerve. Not only does it control those skeletal muscles and move your eyeball around in the eye socket to let you look up and down and right and left, but it also controls the dilation of your pupil and the focusing mechanism of your lens, oculomotor. Next is trochlear. Trochlear is another motor nerve. It controls just one muscle of eye movement. Some of your muscles that move your eye are controlled by oculomotor. The trochlear is just one muscle, controls just one muscle in the eye socket to help you move your eye around. That muscle is called trochlear, kind of like the trochlea of your elbow, where your humerus and ulna meet there. There's a joint there, named for its pulley-like groove in there. And this particular muscle has a pulley-like function. It kind of loops over a ligament and attaches to your eye to pull your eye up and to the middle in there. It's the way that works. That's why they call it the trochlear. Next, trigeminal. Trigeminal is mixed. It has both motor and sensory functions. It's a mixed cranial nerve. Trigeminal is named that because there are three primary branches. One branch that goes to the area around your eye, the ophthalmic branch. The next branch goes to the area of the upper jaw, the maxillary branch. And then the third branch goes to the lower jaw, the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve. The next nerve is the abducens. The abducens abducts the eye. So again, it is a motor nerve. It's the third of our motor nerves that will move the eyeball in the eye socket. The abducens nerve. It abducts the eye and it causes the eyeball to look to the side, look laterally. Next, the facial nerve. Facial nerve is another large mixed nerve. It contains both motor and sensory functions. The seventh cranial nerve. And you can see that it's identified as facial because it has some control of some of your facial muscles of the facial expression out there, but it also has a significant function for the sensation of taste Most of the front part of your tongue is coordinated through the facial nerve. Next, vestibulocochlear nerve, vestibulocochlear. This is your 8th cranial nerve, and it is sensory. It is sometimes called the acoustic or auditory nerve. It gives you your sense of hearing there through that particular nerve. The vestibular structure of the inner ear is a structure that helps with balance and equilibrium. So those inner ear functions, balance and equilibrium, both static and dynamic equilibrium, and the sense of hearing all come through that sensory nerve, that 8th cranial nerve, vestibulocochlear. Next, glossopharyngeal. Glosso refers to tongue, and then pharyngeal, the tongue and pharynx region there. This is another mixed cranial nerve. Has both motor and sensory functions associated with it. Some of your sense of taste from the back portion of your tongue is transmitted by the glossopharyngeal nerve. Has some sensation near the opening to your ear canal, the glossopharyngeal, and at least one of your muscles that raises your throat when you swallow is involved there. Next, vagus. Vagus gets its name from the same term, same root word as vagrant or vagabond. It has to do with wandering. This nerve wanders further from your brain. It goes down into your thoracic and abdominal cavity. So the vagus nerve, it is also a mixed nerve. Has both sensory and motor functions. Sensory functions in your pharynx region, and to some extent inside your ear canal, in there. Sensory functions also from your thoracic and abdominal organs. So a tummy ache or pain in your chest or something of that sort, coming through your vagus nerve. Next, the accessory. This is sometimes called the spinal accessory because it runs along next to some of your spinal nerves on its way out of the cranial cavity there. It's an accessory to the vagus nerve. It runs right along next to and comes out of the brain next to the vagus nerve. So it's an accessory to the vagus. But it's primarily motor. I see I put sensory of my vestibulocochlear in green instead of red. Now back to the accessory. This motor nerve controls contraction of the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles. Sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles. Under the control of the accessory nerve, motor nerve. The final one down here, the hypoglossal. It's primarily motor also. Goes to muscles of the tongue. Hypo means below, glossal refers to tongue again, so we saw that same term up here. Hypoglossal, below the tongue. This is controlling the movement, the motor control of your tongue. Those are your 12 cranial nerves: olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibulocochlear, and glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal. 12 cranial nerves. From the front of your brain to the back of your brain, along the floor of the brain underneath, you would see these nerves arise in pairs all the way back. Next, we're going to look at each of these in a little more detail. We're going to begin our look at the cranial nerves in more detail now, looking at 3 nerves that are only sensory. They only bring sensory information into the brain. So the first one up here is the olfactory sense of smell. These cells in orange right here represent your olfactory cells. This is an olfactory cell here. These cells relay a fiber, or they conduct a fiber, they don't have to relay it. It's part of the cell that extends up to the brain. This is the floor of the brain here. There are these special cells up here. They're called mitral cells. You don't need to know that. But anyway, those are inside the brain. So they connect directly to cells within the brain. Then the mitral cells conduct that signal on back to other parts of the brain where you interpret everything about the sense of smell there. So your olfactory cells occupy the epithelial layer. This is a pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium in your nose, but it contains these special olfactory cells. It's a small patch of sensory epithelium about the size of the end of your finger or so, up in the top of each nostril is where you would find that. So that's the first cranial nerve, the olfactory nerve. These cells originate as part of the surface ectoderm, like your skin has its same origin there. But as the face develops, this tissue becomes folded in to the inside of your head and part of that nasal epithelium up in there. So anyway, it begins as ectodermal placode, is what we call that little area of cells that becomes olfactory epithelium. So that's a sense of smell. Next, the optic nerve. This represents the optic nerve right here. This represents the retina. So this starts as an outgrowth from the diencephalon of the brain, the second brain region, and the brain grows out and forms this cup that becomes the retina right across here. The cells are layered here so that your rods and cones, your vision cells, are at the back of your retina. And as they are stimulated, they release neurotransmitters to intermediate cells. Those intermediate cells eventually send their neurotransmitters onto what we call ganglion cells. So the ganglion cell has an axon fiber that will reach on in through the optic nerve. It's just continuous there. So anyway, these ganglion cells relay your sense of sight to your brain. So that's nerve number 2, the optic nerve. And all of this was simply an outgrowth of the brain rather than being part of your outer epithelium when it began. So they have very different origins. This has a very direct connection to your nervous system. This is relayed to a cell called mitral cells before going in. Next, the vestibulocochlear nerve. This is your 8th cranial nerve, the 3rd of your major sensory nerves. This represents semicircular canals here. These loops. This is the vestibular apparatus in the middle, and this is the cochlea here. So between your vestibular apparatus and your cochlea, we have nerve fibers that are going to be bringing information into the brain. Now, represented in red here, what we often refer to as the spiral ganglion. So there's your spiral ganglion. And over here, this represents the vestibular ganglion. In both cases, there is a receptor cell type within the structure, within the cochlea, or within the vestibule or semicircular canal. So you have a receptor, and that receptor relays to a nerve ending here. That nerve ending communicates with the ganglion cell, and the ganglion cell then sends another nerve fiber on into the brain. So where we see this spiral ganglion here, there would be fibers coming to the cells and then on into the brain, all along there. Very different from what we saw in the olfactory and in the optic nerve. 3 different means of getting the information to the sensory cells and getting them then eventually to the brain. This has an important intermediary, this ganglion cell right here. So those are your 3 cranial nerves that are primarily only sensory: olfactory, optic, and vestibulocochlear. All right, next we are going to look at 5 cranial nerves that are only motor. They only send signals out, or they principally send signals out. 3 of them have to do with eye movement, controlling eye movement. 2 of them are separate from that, the accessory and the hypoglossal. Let's go ahead and identify just all of these are simple motor relays, with the exception of the oculomotor up here. It has a part that's going to be a little different, but they all simply have a motor neuron within the brain that is going to send an axon fiber out to the effector organ, out to the muscle that's being controlled. There are several muscles that go from the 3rd cranial nerve to be controlled by that route. The trochlear is a simple direct route to an eye muscle, in this case the trochlear muscle, or there's another name for it. But anyway, this one goes to the abducens, another eye muscle. So those are pretty simple. The accessory has a direct route, motor route, to the sternocleidomastoid, and the trapezius. So that's pretty easy to understand. Also, a direct motor signal, motor neuron in the central nervous system. It travels out through a peripheral nerve to its destination, stimulates muscle contraction there. Same sort of thing with the hypoglossal nerve. Well, this time it's tongue muscles that are affected. So all of those routes are very simple and easy to understand. You have a motor neuron in the central nervous system. It sends its motor axon out through a spinal or through a cranial nerve to the designated organ. That muscle group causes contraction of the muscle and it's stimulated. Now, I mentioned the oculomotor has something a little different going on in part of it. That's because it controls the focusing mechanism inside your eye and the pupil dilation of your eye. And in that case, the signal that comes from the nervous system passes through ganglion. This is an autonomic route, not a somatic route. So here we have another ganglion cell that's stimulated, and that goes to ciliary muscle, which controls your focus, and iris muscle. It controls diameter of your pupil. So there's a ganglion out there, a structure, a group of nerve cells outside of the central nervous system. This ganglion here is called the ciliary ganglion. Ciliary ganglion. Okay, so those are things that are principally just motor. They just carry out motor signals to the effectors. All right, the first of our 4 mixed nerves, we're going to look at these one at a time. This is the simplest of our 4 mixed nerves. It has both incoming and outgoing information. Like most incoming information, there's a ganglion there along the way that your signal passes through, a clump of ganglion cells that receive information and then relay that to the brain. This ganglion lies very close to the brain, the floor of the brain, back inside your skull. But anyway, your area where you get sensation on your face, most of your facial region, all your tactile senses, heat and cold, and touch and pressure and so forth, all that kind of general tactile information for your face is conducted through this ganglion that's outside of the brain. It's called the trigeminal ganglion there on the floor of the brain. And then there are axon fibers from that go on into the brain centers. This is very much like what we saw with the reflex arc when we looked at that and the cross-section of spinal cord. There was a ganglion outside of the central nervous system that relayed that information in. Same thing going on here with the trigeminal. There's also along that same pathway in that same group of nerve fibers that go the other direction, and they reach out to what we call muscles of the first visceral arch. Now that means that area is one of the most anterior of the areas around your pharynx when your body is developing. So muscles of the first visceral arch that you would know might include the temporalis up on the side of your head above your ear, and the major chewing muscle, the masseter muscle, on the side of the face that closes your jaw. So anyway, this is the trigeminal. It has incoming and outgoing information. The incoming is always passing through a ganglion on its way to the brain. This is a simple somatic route going out, so your motor neuron is inside the central nervous system, and the axon fiber goes directly to the effectors out there. Okay, next, mixed cranial nerve is the seventh cranial nerve. You have the brain centers over here. You have the peripheral nervous system connecting to different parts of the body over here on this side. First of all, the sensory route, the incoming information. Again, it goes through a ganglion on the way between its origin and the brain. This particular ganglion is called the geniculate ganglion. We can just think of it as the facial ganglion coming in here. The sense of taste on the anterior portions of your tongue will come through this route. Also, sensation, general sensation of your oral mucosa, the lining of your mouth. So most of that from the front of your mouth is coming in through the nerve number 7. Parts of the back of the mouth, both taste and sensation, will be through your 9th cranial nerve in the same fashion. So that's incoming information to the brain through the 7th cranial nerve. Outgoing information includes both a typical somatic route, goes directly to effectors, and it includes a autonomic route that has to pass through a ganglion cell before reaching its destination. The first one here, going directly to musculature, the motor route there, goes to muscles of facial expression. Facial expression, or what we sometimes identify as pharyngeal arch number 2 muscle group, pharyngeal expression in that group there. So that goes directly from the brain to the muscle, a direct route, motor route. The next one has to pass through a ganglion on the way. Mainly we think of lacrimal gland. That's your tear production in your eye. Some of the mucus production in your nasal passages as well. And your salivary secretions are stimulated here. So these are secretory. These are glands that are being activated through an autonomic route. Primarily parasympathetic. They're stimulating those tear production, some of the mucus secretion and salivation in your oral cavity. Part of the salivary function is also carried out by number 9 again, so we'll see that here next. So we have incoming from taste and oral mucosa through a ganglion. We have direct somatic innervation of facial expression, and we have this kind of indirect autonomic type of innervation going through a ganglion cell to the lacrimal gland and some of our salivary glands. Now the third of our mixed nerves, this is nerve number 9, the 9th cranial nerve, glossopharyngeal nerve. We have incoming information, sensory information that passes through ganglia. We actually have ganglia at 2 different locations for 2 different functions on the incoming route along nerve number 9. The first set up here of incoming information, this is the taste and oral mucosa at the back of your mouth. So we have the 7th cranial nerve had sense of taste and sensation of the oral mucosa. Up there toward the front, and no, this is toward the back. So this is taste and oral lining here coming in. In addition to that incoming information, there's a little bit of tactile information from the region of the auditory meatus. Right there. So anyway, incoming information passing through ganglia, just like along their spinal ganglia. Now, outgoing information. The musculature that's controlled by the 9th cranial nerve is actually part of your 3rd pharyngeal arch. This single muscle that's involved here is a muscle that raises the larynx up toward the hyoid. It's the stylopharyngeus muscle. It's stimulated by motor neurons that travel out the 9th cranial nerve. Now, the other route outward along the autonomic route here, this goes through what's called an otic ganglion, and it goes to a single salivary gland, the parotid gland, a large salivary gland that's on the outside of your face, more to the outside, right across there, in front of your ear, and on the corner of your jaw. So that gland right there is stimulated by this autonomic route. And now the last of our cranial nerves to consider, the vagus nerve, the 10th cranial nerve, has both incoming and outgoing information, both sensory and motor parts. The incoming information, again, divided between 2 ganglia. We have one set of incoming information that is primarily well, it's a little bit of taste and pharynx, sensation, and the region of the epiglottis. Not taste from the tongue, but there are other sensors back there, taste sensations back there in the throat associated with the epiglottis and that region of the pharynx that come in that route. But also there are divisions that go down into your thoracic and abdominal cavity. We're just going to call that visceral sensation. Visceral sensation. So that's coming in there. The other ganglion going in there, that just carries a little bit of sensory information from the region of your auditory canal. So that's this one here. Comes in through a separate ganglion along that same pathway, that incoming sensory information. Now, the outgoing information, the motor information, has both a somatic route that goes directly to the effectors, and it has a separate route here that's autonomic that goes to visceral structures in there. And that's what most of that is. The only motor control over muscle here, this is a 4th and 5th arch muscles. These are mainly throat musculature we're looking at there, associated with the larynx and the hyoid down in that area. 4th and 5th arch muscles in the throat are going to be controlled by the 10th cranial nerve. And then this route here is to visceral organs. Controlling the activity of different visceral organs. So your stomach, intestines, and pancreas, the secretion of bile from your gallbladder, some of your respiratory functions, controlling heart rate and so forth. So a lot of different visceral functions. The motor route is there, the incoming information coming through the other part of the 10th cranial nerve there. And remember, that's why it's called the vagus, because it wanders away from the head. It's not just found in affecting things close to the head, but it wanders out and makes contacts with distant structures in the thoracic and abdominal cavities.